Hi, everybody. I'm Maddie Reardon. I'm the Community Engagement and Outreach Manager for 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. For those of you who are not familiar with Radio Milwaukee, we are a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station with the mission of creating a more inclusive and engaged Milwaukee through music and stories. During this pandemic, we have been able to expand our reach and to host guests from all over the world. In addition to our wonderful Radio Milwaukee members, we have a couple of additional supporters without whom programming and conversations like this around our podcast, By Every Measure, would not be possible. So I'd like to thank the Brico Fund, Argosy Foundation, and Zilber Family Foundation. Our By Every Measure Ask the Experts series is just one tactic we're using to get people talking about systemic racism and how we as individuals and organizations can use our collective power to dismantle some of these systems and educate our networks on these topics. This particular series of conversations will happen for the next 2 weeks in addition to this one, each Thursday at the same time. But we've also created an opportunity for smaller conversations to happen, our By Every Measure conversation clubs. These conversation clubs are a 6-week commitment designed to take a deep dive into each episode of our podcast, By Every Measure, with the same group of individuals so we can build rapport and trust with one another and to have open and honest conversations. These conversation clubs are going to be starting the week of February 15th, Wednesdays from 4 to 5 p.m. or Thursdays from noon to 1. And you can find more information about these conversation clubs and how to secure your spot at radiomilwaukee.org or by reaching out to me directly. You'll see my email address at the bottom of your screen in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to hand this conversation over to our membership manager, Lily Rand.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. I'm Lily, and I manage our membership program. So as Maddie had mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. And so we are able to offer spaces like these and to share these conversations as widely as possible because of support from individuals. It's really based on community interest that we're able to have these events and to make podcasts like By Every Measure. And the reason that we're able to follow through on the work is because of support from the community, which is individuals like you. So any amount that you're able to give will support spaces like these, will allow us to share these resources free of charge to as many people as we can possibly reach. And will also make you part of our membership program where you'll have a chance to get to know us better and engage more with our programming. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can find out at radiomilwaukee.org and click the orange heart, and you'll be able to read through all about our membership program and what it offers. And again, thank you so much for being part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Lily. And with that, let's get to the reason that you all are watching today. By Every Measure, Ask the Experts in the Racial Wealth Gap with Radio Milwaukee's Tarik Moody and Inequality.org's Omar Ocampo.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Lily. Omarcampo is a researcher for the program on inequality and the common good. He graduated from the University of Massachusetts, Boston with a BA in political science and holds a master's in international relations from the American University in Cairo. His thesis focused on politics of an international oil and humanitarian intervention in Libya. Prior to joining the Institute of Policy Studies, Omar was an intern for Congressman Stephen F. Lynch. He later entered the nonprofit sector where he worked in direct human and social services. So please welcome Omar Ocampo.
Thank you for having me, Tarik. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Before we get into this conversation, racial wealth gap, this is like one of the episodes we did on By Every Measure. One I feel like personally invested in. Pun intended. I want to state some facts here that I want to pull together before we get into questions. Like recently, there was a story by the author of The Black Tax, Sean Rochester. Racism has cost Black Americans $70 trillion since the start of slavery, which is, I can't even figure what that looks like. You know, I barely know what $10,000 looks like. And then Citibank put out a report on racial wealth gap, and they said in a new study, $16 trillion has been erased from the U.S. GDP over the last 2 decades due to discrimination. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. We're like the government's, fighting over $1.9 trillion for COVID relief, and realizing over the last 2 decades, we have lost $16 trillion due to the fact of systemic racism and discrimination. Before I get into it, I want to ask a simple question. I think people get confused about wealth and money and richness and being rich. Can you describe actually what does wealth actually means in the term of racial wealth gap?
Yeah, so the racial wealth gap is the disparity in the distribution of assets that exist along racial lines. So, for example, wealth is normally defined as your assets minus liabilities. So an asset can be what's in your savings account, any property that you own, whether it's a home or business, stocks, pension entitlements. It is not your income. So basically, it's assets. So its wealth is assets minus liabilities, and the liability is basically any debt that you have. So it's like your mortgage, credit card debt, student debt, or anything that you own, like your vehicle loan, stuff like that.
And from what I understood from doing this podcast and doing a lot of research, I've heard a lot of people say there's two main ways to build wealth in this country. One is real estate housing, and the other is entrepreneurship. Is that true, or are there other ways of building wealth when it comes to this issue here?
Yeah, so definitely home ownership, is a big way to build wealth. So that's part of like the national ethos that makes up the American dream, is owning your own home, and owning your own home is one of the main pillars for building wealth and generational wealth. So, generally speaking, a home is an asset that appreciates over time. So, here in Boston, where I'm located, if you bought a home 20 years ago for like $200,000, it can easily be worth like $600,000 or $800,000 today, and that is a lot of equity that you can put into purchasing maybe another home, funding education, or starting a business. So yeah, and there was a period in U.S. history where the federal government supported the expansion of home ownership. And it was like relatively easy to build wealth, but African Americans were systematically left out of it.
And mentioning that, I think I was listening to a podcast featuring the author Marisha Baradadan, author of Color Money, where she talked about this and talked about capitalism. People we're a capitalist country, but she said basically Black people, only people really experience capitalism, which capitalism means there's no help from anybody. You do it on your own. Mm-hmm. And then white Americans actually had a little bit of socialism to help them build wealth. Is that how she phrased it? Which made me think wow, that's interesting, because you brought up the FHA loans and all the Homestead Act. That's not the whole thing. That's not capitalism. That's really government helping people to build wealth, to become middle class. But those programs left out a lot of Black people, a huge amount of Black people, which in the case of wealth, that wealth built over time and generation. And what happened was, I understood, people be able to inherit it, give money to their kids for their own home or go to college, and Black people had nothing. Do you agree with that kind of statement?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think in the United States, whether it's the capitalist class or people who have an ideological commitment to free markets, they lecture us on how awesome and great the free market is, but they spend most of their efforts trying to avoid the free market, and also restricting access to people to have access to the market in order to create and generate wealth. And and like you said, African Americans were systematically left out of of periods of in U.S. history where the U.S. government provided a lot of assistance in home ownership and building wealth and subsidies, and when in the home ownership, there's the legacy of redlining, which is a discriminatory practice where banks refused or limited availability of home loans to specific neighborhoods based on their racial composition of the residents. And and the neighborhoods that were demarcated as undesirable, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, those neighborhoods are today deprived of jobs, of investment, of opportunity, of public resources. And I think what's interesting today is that I think there's a relationship between the footprint of redlining and gentrification, because wealth is moving back into these neighborhoods, but not to the benefit of the residents who already live there. So, this just contributes more to the racial wealth gap, to housing insecurity and displacements. And I remember reading, Jeff Chang. He said this is basically the resegregation of America, and I think that we need to correct this historical wrong, and where there needs to be a program that increases home ownership for families in neighborhoods that have been historically redlined. So I think the federal government can provide grants that can be used to help with down payments or help refinance mortgages, or mortgages at a risk of foreclosure, or people who have negative equity. That those are things that need to be done, and those were advantages that a lot of Americans had 60 years ago.
And basically, I think federal government can play a big role in changing this, but also think the population needs to agree with this. Don't you agree? Like, why should a white family in a suburb who's doing well, doesn't even have affected by this, should they care and support such these initiatives?
Well, I think people should care about these initiatives because inequality as a whole has a very negative effect on democracy. And the way, we can just see it with the instance of, money in politics. The billionaires or, people who control capital, they have a vested interest in, protecting their wealth from taxation. And then they deploy their resources politically for economic ends. And, they hire, an army of professionals to exploit the tax system, fund think tanks, donate to political campaigns. And then when they get in trouble, they get bailed out as opposed to, being held accountable for, the risky behavior that they engage in. And, and I think that it is, this is just good for democracy, when there's material inequality, there's also political inequality. And this is what the rich want. They want an imbalance in political power so they can protect their, economic interest, and force democratic institutions to be unresponsive to their voters. So there for for someone in the suburbs, decreasing wealth inequality and racial wealth inequality just increases democracy, and democracy is freedom.
And let's talk about current events. The pandemic, recessions has basically kind of peeled away these inequalities even more glaringly, like put a real spotlight on them. Can you talk to me, and how and why do recessions and a pandemic impact Black people more than white people?
Yeah. So in general, so like you said, like the pandemic revealed the existence of high levels of inequality. So people with higher incomes are more likely to be able to work from home than low-wage workers, and low-wage workers were either laid off at higher rates or they had to physically go into work. So as a result, they're at higher risk of contracting the coronavirus, and this all has a racial dimension. Black and Hispanic workers are less likely than whites to be able to work from home, and more likely to be in industries that are considered essential. So while COVID-19 is a threat to everyone, not all social groups and economic classes are impacted equally. And also because there is a racial wealth gap, families with less wealth, typically Black and Latino, when there's income disruptions, they don't have wealth that they can rely on in order to, smoothen out consumption or to hold them over for the next, let's say, six months. So this is why, the COVID-19 impacts, Black communities more than white communities.
And also I read that, as far as the home and the jobs, but it even affects Black businesses, small businesses.
Oh.
Like I read that almost 50% of Black-owned small businesses have shut their doors since this pandemic. Why is that? Like, business, like all business has been hurt by the pandemic. Well, why Black businesses are hurt even more?
That's actually a really interesting stat, and that's something that I actually have not looked into. But and unfortunately, like the trend is that a lot of these businesses are probably going to be shut down permanently, and this just increases the power of the already rich corporations. So something like Amazon, this just plays into their hands. They just have they're gonna corner the market more and increase their market share, and that's not a good thing. And I think what you said, it just says that there needs to be an imperative to invest in small businesses, and particularly Black businesses.
We've been talking a lot about the problems, and I can go on about the stats, and which just gets me angry and mad. But like, you did a piece, which was called, let me pull it up real here, the question I had. You had a report called "White Supremacy is the Pre-Existing Condition." You list eight solutions to reduce the racial wealth gap. Can you talk about them? And I want you to start with postal banking. Maresha Baranon brought up postal banking, which is I was like, I didn't know about postal banking, but can you talk about postal banking? Like, one, kind of the history is really fascinating, but why do you think this could help reduce the racial wealth gap? So start with that solution.
Yeah. So for African Americans, they have high rates of unbanked or underbanked. So the unbanked and underbanked rates for African American households is really high, and there are reasons for this. So like, there could be no local banks in your neighborhood or anything that's nearby, or the bank fees may be too high, or they simply don't have enough money to keep in an account, or they may just simply not trust the financial institutions. And we argue that this has dire consequences because one of the obvious consequences is that there's lack of access to credit. So without a bank account and a credit card, it is difficult to build a credit history. And if they don't have a bank account or don't have easy access to credit, people tend to look for alternative financial services, which may include payday lending, check cashing, pawn shops, and they have increased interest rates. And there's less like consumer protection. And I think that one way to remedy this, where people can have more access to credit, is to have the postal service provide financial services, and they can do this independently, or they can do this in partnership with private financial institutions. And it just provides Black households the opportunity to access financial services, save money, and start to build wealth.
And kind of history, there used to be postal banking back in the day, and they got like till the late 60s, 70s. I basically think they got rid of it. But do you think is there any movement on this in legislation, or anybody pushing for this kind of concept, or is it like, I feel like the payday loan lobbies will fight this tooth and nail to prevent the post office getting to the banking system? You think this even what's the chance of this like happening, you think?
Well, unfortunately for the short term, there's actually not much movement. I mean, unfortunately, that last year with the attack that President Donald Trump had on the U.S. Postal Services, that they create like some of a movement to help save the Postal Service, which is also an important source for jobs for African Americans. That's a good thing to add. But the thing is, people need to organize and start fighting for, for financial services to be extended by USPS, because the USPS is, a institution that's familiar, it's trustworthy, and it reaches, basically every single corner of the country, because there's also, like private services, like let's say like FedEx or UPS, they don't go to certain areas because they know that it's not profitable to go there. So there isn't a profit motive, and it's essential that we reinstate postal banking.
So can you talk about some of the other solutions that was mentioned in that report? and like why, like talk about how those solutions can help reduce the racial wealth gap.
Yeah. So one that I'm a really big fan of is mainly because I'm a fan of the programs that where it's designed to build assets, right? So one is the baby bond program, which is it will provide every single newborn with an account of $1,000, and then every year they increase. They add in an additional like $0 to like $2,000 per year, depending on the family income. And the idea is that a child will have access to this account once he or she turns 18 years old, and then they can invest that money into other endeavors that's designed to build assets. So you can start a business, or you can purchase a home. And there was research done by Naomi Zudi where she shows that this program will close the racial wealth gap, and she compared like the current disparities between like your median young white and a median young African American. And right now, the disparity in wealth is 16 times. So a white young person has 16 times more wealth than a young black person. But with the implementation of the baby bond program, the disparity would decrease all the way down to 1.4. The disparity, and interestingly, this actually has some momentum thanks to like Cory Booker. This was one of his platforms during his presidential run, and he and Ayanna Pressley are actually like pressuring Joe Biden to include a baby bond program in some type of COVID relief package, and that would be excellent. Another program I think would be something like a universal basic income or a guaranteed income program, and I would like to diverge a little bit, because we already have something like this in the United States, and it's in Alaska. So Alaska has like a permanent fund where they pay their citizens let's say like about like $1,000 to $2,000 every year, just simply for being a resident of Alaska. And it started in the in 1970s, and they decided to start that fund with the profits from the oil sector. So they discovered oil in the 1960s, and once it went into production, they put 25% of the oil profits into that fund, and then they invested it in assets like the stock market or real estate. And today that fund is worth over $60 billion. Now I'm thinking like, we can do this on a national scale, and we can bring assets into like a national fund. So we can follow Alaska's lead and have some of the profits from oil and gas, or we can extend it to other natural resources like uranium and gold. We can include taxes, like wealth taxes on the wealthiest, or whenever a company goes public, we can just tax that. But I will also peg it to the tech industry. We're living in an age where everything is being digitized and slowly automated, and the pandemic has benefited the tech companies, and they're coming out stronger and wealthier and bigger. And they're also making money off of our digital footprint. Like Facebook doesn't produce any original content. You and I produce the content on Facebook, and then they make a profit off of it. And I think that we probably deserve some type of return on that. So once this fund is established, and you can grant every single citizen a share, or any person that qualifies to get a share, and then a dividend can be paid off monthly or yearly, just for being alive. And that kind of provides like like some income security. So if you lose your job, you can have something that comes in and provides some security.
I want to talk about the tech companies, but first I want to highlight some facts you pointed out. One that might people not know: the median Black family today basically has about $3,600 in household wealth. Or about 2% of the median white families of $147,000, which that's just ridiculous. In which the median Latinx family has assets of $6,600, or 4% of the white median family. Another fact that I think you pointed out in that report: the top 12 U.S. billionaires have a combined wealth of $921 billion, which is equivalent to all the home equity wealth of the entire Black population, over 17 million households. And I got sad again. So thank you for making me upset and sad.
Sorry.
Let's talk about these companies and corporations. You know, we've had some might call it a racial reckoning since Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Corporations from left and right, different sectors, especially tech, have been committing millions and some billions of dollars towards racial justice and equity. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think these efforts are permanent? Do you think these efforts are making a dent? Like, for example, Apple has done a lot of commitment. They give $10 million to Harlem Capital, Black-led venture capital, invest in other companies to help them grow, invest in HBCUs. Netflix is putting money in banks to help investments. What's your thoughts about corporate responsibility towards this wage gap? And what do you think about what's going on now? Or if they're doing the right thing, or what else should they be doing?
Yeah, so I'm going to use an example of the NBA because I'm personally a big fan of basketball, diehard Celtics fan, and
I'm sorry, terribly sorry about that, but anyway.
So one thing is that last year during the playoffs, there was actually a big marketing campaign on being pro Black Lives Matter. And there was actually a really interesting article in The Verge that, despite, all the marketing, campaign, the owners were actually not big fans of, basically being forced to do that. So because if you look at all, their political campaign contributions, it not only does it dwarf what they're investing in, for equity, for racial equity and justice, they're supporting policies that would actually make the racial wealth gap and wealth gap in general worse, because what they most want is deregulation, lower taxes, and a less strong labor movement. And that this is something that Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics, he said, like, there's a gap between what they say, what they're marketing, and what they're actually doing behind closed doors. So I think they could be investing more. These are just crumbs from the banquet. They can be investing more, and they can also have more input from their players. Maybe they could have more pay higher salaries, have workers be part of the decision making process. So that's what I think. I think that this is a good marketing campaign for everyone who's donating, but are they actually going to seek for structural change, or institutional change? And I don't see that things are changing institutionally.
So you don't feel like there's not a corporation that's doing it right? Like, for example, Netflix says, well, I'm not just going to give money to organizations, but I'm going to give my money and put it in banks. Or Atlanta Hawks, for example, talking about basketball, they actually put their money inside Black banks to help grow their wealth and like invest in building property and building facilities with money they put in Black banks. Do you think those kind of efforts are more valuable or more powerful or more of that? Or what's your thoughts on that? Like, where they putting their money is more important than just the amount of money.
No, it's definitely important, because one thing that people of color lack in the United States is is resources and access to resources. But then this goes into the whole question about, like, should we prefer philanthropy or taxation? Because the problem with something like philanthropy and just donating, like, let's say $10 million compared to something that the state can do, is that the scale is completely different. So something one organization is not going to be able to tackle, like, let's say, like, a random problem like the homelessness in the United States. A charity is not gonna take care of that. That's something that needs a good public policy in order to eliminate something like that. And I feel the same way about the racial wealth gap. that I think that there needs to be institutional change as opposed to something that's just at the margins. But obviously, something is better than nothing. And putting money into financial institutions or other programs is definitely a step in the right direction.
Do you have any like case studies? The federal government is not as nimble as a state or a city. Are there any states or local districts doing something innovative to address some of these issues of the racial wealth gap you know of?
Yeah, if we want to stick to to tech, let's say here in Boston, there is actually like a coding boot camp called Resilient Coders, and it was actually started by someone who was in the tech industry, and he gets money from from the city and from the from other private tech companies. To basically, his whole goal is to get people of color into coding, and he does this for free. So if you qualify, if you're from like a low income or you're also from like a particular neighborhood that is low income in Boston, and they basically teach you 4 years of computer science in like 5-6 months for free, and then when you graduate, people from like Microsoft, Google, they're at your graduation, so they'll look at your portfolio right then and there, and most people actually get hired right away. I think that is an excellent way to get people into the tech sector.
And other question I had is about, there's an ongoing debate, you hear these articles about financial literacy will help close the racial wealth gap. And then you hear articles like, no, it won't. What's your thoughts about financial literacy? Personally, I feel that's like I don't spend money, just give them some books and then they'll build wealth. So what's your thoughts about when people say, well, Black people and brown people just need to know how to manage money better? And, my dad says, well, they don't have money to manage. So what's your thoughts about this whole financial literacy push that I see from certain companies and corporations? Like, I'm going to invest in financial literacy to close the racial wealth gap. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with your father. So the financial literacy is part of the whole like personal responsibility argument. And on the I think it appeals on the surface for like two reasons. Like one, it creates like a binary logic. Like that is to say, people are successful or fail due to like good or poor decision making, and personal finances comes into that. There's like this meme where like, the reason why you can't afford a $5 million condo in downtown is because you spend your money on avocado toast. But it's a second reason I think this appeals is because it absolves people and American institutions from any responsibility in creating the conditions that generate a racial wealth gap. And I also think it reinforces the belief of American exceptionalism, where it's like, anyone can come in here with $100 in their pocket, and then within the generation, they can build wealth. But the evidence simply just doesn't support the personal responsibility argument. Like research shows that like with everything being equal, that, equal amounts of education, or if you're being conservative with your finances, it just does not close the racial wealth gap. The Institute on Assets and Social Policy, they demonstrate that when education levels are equal, the median white adult has 7.2 times more wealth than the median African American adult, which leads one to conclude that there's discrimination in the labor market. And a close cousin to like the personal responsibility argument that is popular among conservatives is that there's a lack of the two-family households, the single motherhood, but white two-parent households have 10 times more wealth than Black two-parent households, and in fact, a white single-parent household has twice the wealth as a median Black two-parent household. So all things being equal, personal responsibility does not explain and what you do with your personal finances does not explain the racial wealth gap.
And then like people hear these numbers and facts, and like people like I want to do something, but I don't know how I can do it. Like people say it'll take, close to 300 years to close the gap. Like I'm an individual. I live in the suburbs. I do care about this. I can't do anything, but what would you say to that? What can people do? What can we do to help make a difference in this on an individual level? Even what would you say to a company or corporation? What kind of advice would you give to an individual, a nonprofit, a philanthropy, as far as how should they address this issue and how can they make a dent in this issue to help close this gap? Because the gap is very complex. It's like housing, entrepreneurship, the pay gap. Like it's not, and it's generation over generation over generation. So how do we get our hands dirty? Like how do we, at different sectors, like start with individuals. How do individuals can make a difference?
So in a liberal democracy, I think the best way an individual can get involved is to actually vote for politicians who have a commitment to closing the racial wealth gap and increasing home ownership. I think what we're seeing now, like Joe Biden came out with reinstating some Fair Act housing rules that Donald Trump repealed. Part of that is because there was a push of social movements, and they organized and voted him in on the idea that that this is a problem, and then he needs to advance that type of these type of policies. I also think that we're going to have to get rid of this idea of taxation as being bad, because to my surprise, in my research of researching inequality, is that that the economic policies of the Republican Party is actually not even popular with its own base. So they all favor higher taxes on the rich, and the Trump's 2017 tax cut is like one of the most unpopular pieces of legislation in modern history. So there's a space for bipartisanship there, where we can say, we can tax the billionaire class, or like people who are ultra high net worth, and we can tax them and then divert those funds into productive programs that help provide, let's say, something like universal health care, or free public education, or canceling student debt, or like I was saying earlier with home ownership, providing grants for people from historically redlined neighborhoods, grants for them to be able to purchase a home.
What would you say to corporations, like as far as helping to close their racial gap? I mean, you've seen corporations step up. Do you have any advice for the corporations, what they can do more? Like what should the role of Fortune 500 companies be in this space?
Yeah, I think they should allow for greater power amongst their workforce, because a lot of people that like Amazon, they have a lot of workers who are black and brown, but yet they're only paying them $15 an hour, and and they're making Amazon one of the most productive companies, and I mean one of the most profitable companies in the world. So there should be some type of mechanism where people are compensated for their productivity and for the wealth that they help produce, and this can be done by growing the labor movement, having workers participate on the boards of their companies, or have some type of some more democratic mechanisms. And yeah, I also want to add like the Target, for example, like they actually they have like same day delivery systems. Like, so you order something online, it gets delivered the same day. And the way they pay those workers who drive is based on an algorithm. So it all depends on how busy the store is. So if the store is not that busy and there's not a lot of traffic, somehow the algorithm takes that into account, and therefore it actually lowers the wages of the drivers. And a lot of these drivers are people of color.
Someone asked, Brian here asked, and how can people help without the government being involved? Is there things that individuals can do without government? Like you hear people like go support, Black owned businesses, but what else can people do? Are there organizations out there that they can volunteer for that's not part of the government working to solve these issues? Or
Yeah, so I definitely think that you can join social movements that are seeking for some structural change. So something like Black Lives Matter, or joining to the labor movement, or even joining like housing justice movements. Boston is one among many cities that's being gentrified, and it's the city's becoming unaffordable. Prices are skyrocketing, and they're basically trying to reclaim and fight for affordable housing, and especially in the context of a pandemic. They're for canceling the rents. And yeah, so there's no need to I would say reinvent the wheel, because there's a lot of organizations out there that's doing a lot of important work. There, like I said, Black Lives Matter, or Mi Gente is another group for people who are Latinx, where they organize along a pro-Black, pro-immigrant, pro-worker principle.
And the one thing I'm passionate about, again, going back to tech, I'm big on the tech startups, and I see the thing about tech entrepreneurship compared to other entrepreneurship is about the scale, right? Which helps build wealth and investment. And there's been a lot of stats about women, minority, people of color, Blacks getting single digits, or Black women even was getting 0.05% of the venture capital for their businesses. And there's a theory, a concept that these tech startups can help grow wealth fast and build wealth quicker because of what tech is, right? It's about scale. It's about growth. It's Facebook, Amazon, it's scale. Like Calendly, which is a Black-owned company, the Calendly you schedule a link for. You've seen that link. The Calendly is schedule my link. Black-owned company just raised $350 million with a $3 billion valuation, a Black-owned company. They call it a unicorn. Do you see this as potentially also an avenue to bring more tech in the community show? Because I feel like if people know about tech and understand tech, people have ideas that this can also play a role in closing the gap. Do you feel like tech, or is it really, it's a harder, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out, because people feel like tech can really play a huge role, especially the startup world, venture capital, in helping close this gap. What's your thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree. So in general, when it comes to tech, we're living in a great time of progress, because everything, like I said, everything's becoming digitized and is transforming society. And a lot of businesses that are they're not even tech businesses, but they're slowly converting to becoming tech businesses, and they need software engineers and data scientists. And it's a dynamic industry, and it's going to continue to grow, and it's going to grow exponentially. And I definitely think that this is an industry that there's potential for growth and jobs, but it also encourages entrepreneurship. Now, and I think this is where we go back to when it comes to lending, there's just not a lot of investment for people who are minority, and especially Black women. They just don't get the venture capital funds in order to make this great idea become into
a national idea.
Yeah. They just don't get the funds. So therefore, there's the for example, you said some company gave a financial institution $100 million, but are they going to use that $100 million to invest in a Black woman who has this great startup idea? So therefore, it's one thing to just donate the money, but also it's how is that money being allocated?
Because it's the other stat about Black women is that's the group that started most businesses in the country. But the problem is, again, going back, the businesses that help the startup businesses is because they can hire more people. But the problem with the Black women business and Black business in general, most of those businesses are single employee businesses, the owner, and that's it, and maybe one other person. While a white business starts hiring more people from their community and helps to grow that community, because those white businesses are getting money to grow their business, to hire new people. So it's kind of a, you see black women have a great idea, but they're not getting the capital to expand their business.
Yeah, and I also think this also relates to like debt. So I mean, if I was like, one of the first steps any leader can take to instantly reduce like the racial wealth gap is to cancel student loans, because not only do African American families rely more heavily on debt to finance their education, but they're also specifically targeted by like predatory lenders. And I read somewhere that over $900 billion of the 1.6 trillion in student debt is currently held by women, particularly Black women. So I say this to drive home the point, because sometimes the venture capital might say, maybe we don't want to invest in this particular person because they have high amounts of debt. To give a very powerful, Bloomberg published a really powerful story last year where they profiled 2 graduates from Morehouse University. One person graduated in 2018 and the other person graduated in 2019. And the person who graduated in 2018 is actually putting off medical school because he has to service his debt and everything's just way too expensive. The person who graduated in 2019, he lucked out because Robert Smith, who's a billionaire, he pledged to wipe out their student debt, in which he did. And that student from 2019 was talking about how he has this economic freedom. So now he has capital himself that he can invest to start a business and apply for a loan. And I think that, canceling student debt is an excellent way to start to not only lower the racial wealth gap, but to have people have better credit worthiness to be so venture capital can actually invest in people who have really good ideas, so therefore they can scale up and have their business idea launch off the ground and be able to hire people and become really profitable.
And it's interesting about the student loan, like most people, this is where the wealth gap comes in play. Most African Americans are either the first or second one in their family to go to college in the generation. And what happens is they might get a good job, but then they're giving that money back to the debt and helping their family who doesn't have wealth to pay off their mortgage or pay off whatever. Well, a typical white family had inherited from their home they got from FHA loan or Homestead Act and built wealth in that. And here's son, daughter, here's some college tuition for you. So again, that gap, those programs that happened back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s are affecting Black families today, especially when it comes to college education and housing. And most people don't think that. They think, oh, that happened back then. It doesn't. What about now? Wealth is over time, right? It's generation and generation. That's how you build wealth. You had a house back in the 50s, it's worth a whole lot more, and you have all this wealth to put in the stocks and YRA. And that's because you were lucky enough to get an interest-free loan from the government, while that Black family couldn't. For example, my dad, who's a veteran like me, got his first house. He was a VA, couldn't get a VA loan. He was declined a VA loan in Kentucky. Luckily, the developer, the person who owned the house, was desperate to sell and made a deal with my dad to get in his first home. So, my dad lucked out in a situation where now he bought a house after we kept moving, invest in a house. That helped me get into college, but luckily I got a scholarship. They use that to put back in their own house. So I can see the impact of just a little thing like that being declined. How's that affect generations after generation? I think most people don't think that. They just think that happened then, get over it. But understand wealth is about time as well. Brian asks again, it was an interesting question. Why do white businesses get more money? Is it only race? Related, or are there other factors? In venture capital, I hear it's because, I went to Stanford, they fit a certain stereotype. It's sort of I'm just gonna give them the money because I know them. There's a story, there's a podcast about 2 startups, similar ideas. The Black startup was already off the ground making revenue. The white startup only has a paper napkin. The white startup got the money. The Black guy is still trying to prove himself. So what is it? Is it just race, or are there other factors involved?
I would argue that I think they all intersect. So I think race probably plays the biggest is probably the biggest factor. And I kind of want to like bring it back to like institutions, for example. Like there's this like economist at MIT who wrote the role institutions have in like economic growth, and he says something that I found like that was really convincing, is that those who have power, like they're interested in developing institutions that protect and grow their power and economic privileges. And those institutions tend to persist and survive over long periods of time. So they're able to maintain the existence balance of power and wealth distribution, even if there's like participation of new political actors in those institutions at a later date. So when we talk about the U.S., like, we can trace this all the way back to the founding fathers, where they created a republic, for privileging, white property. Property owning white men, and they basically enshrined the subjugation and oppression of African Americans, and this persists. It reproduces produces and reproduces the racial wealth gap, and I think that because of that legacy that they inherit from this institutional framework, I think that they have like a certain bias against entrepreneurs who are of a different race and background.
Well, I think I got one more question. So, how optimistic are you? Like, really, like, do you feel like what's going on because of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, what companies going to, even Biden, even though it's only executive order, it's not legislation about the racial equity. Do you feel like this is a permanent path we're going forward, or you think it's only going to last a few years and we'd be back? Like, how do you feel right now about, like, I want to be optimistic. I want to feel like, and I don't want to end on a sour note, but when I read these facts and I see what's happening, it's like, are these corporations going to keep this up for beyond 2021? Is what Biden did to the executive orders, is this going to be legislation? Are city governments really going to take this seriously? Gentrification? I mean, there's so many problems. I mean, how do you feel?
Like in the short term, I'm actually surprisingly optimistic. I'm actually not optimistic in the long term. I think in the short term, I think something like Black Lives Matter, they've completely changed the narrative. They have a lot of public support according to the opinion polls, and they're putting a lot of pressure on private corporations and politicians on addressing some of these things, and basically begin to invest. I remember Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, he once said, like, all the advances that we have is because of Black people were out there, and they were able to, basically they shed blood on the streets in order to have to advance, and to get the advancements that they get from the political class. And I think we're seeing that right now as well. But I think the reason why I'm not optimistic in the long term is, because of the structural, because the structural system is not being dismantled, the wealth concentration is not being disrupted, and I also think that Joe Biden, I think he's too focused on extending a hand to the Republican Party, despite how disruptive and they have been in I would say since like for the past like 50 years, but especially basically since like Obama was elected. They just kept radicalizing and going further to the right, and he wants to basically compromise with them. So that in that sense, I don't feel optimistic. But in the short term, I think there's some positive signs. So therefore, we have to seize the moment. We have to keep up the pressure in order to continue moving people in a direction where that racial equity and racial justice is not just a rhetorical device. It's actually something that has to produce material benefits.
Well, thank you, Omar. Thank you for taking the time to discuss this very complicated and very daunting issue known as the racial wealth gap here on By Every Measure Asks the Experts. And I want to thank Maddie and Lily for putting this together. And if you want to learn more, check out our podcast by every measure at our website at radiomilwaukee.org.
Thank you so much to Omar and Tarik for this extremely important conversation. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. I saw a lively conversation in the chat, so happy this conversation is continuing. And please remember to join us next week, same time, same place, for the fourth conversation in our By Every Measure Ask the Experts series, centered around systemic racism in education with Dr. Howard Fuller of Marquette University.